And thanks for joining us for the Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. I'm your host, Peter Slen. Our guest this week is Kathleen deLaski, who asks the question, who needs college anymore? That podcast begins in a moment. Well, when did the 4-year degree become a gold standard for success? Is it still? And in this information age, is it necessary? What is the best way to learn and advance in a career? Well, Kathleen deLaski, former ABC News reporter, asks these questions in her new book, Who Needs College Anymore? She examines new ways of lifelong learning and whether college for everyone is the right approach to an educated and productive workforce. Our conversation with Kathleen deLaski on the future of higher education begins now. Kathleen deLaski, in your new book, Who Needs College Anymore? Imagining a Future Where Degrees Don't Matter, you write that I believe we are on the cusp of a new era in which college as we know it would become an umbrella descriptor for several proud paths to adultification, skilling, or confidence building. What is that new era?
Well, it's coming soon, and actually I just finished the book in maybe the writing part of the book in, let's say, last summer, and I would say it's even advancing more quickly than at the moment that I put the pen down because of AI, really. But we're moving to an era when I think even people who sort of hold the keys to academia are recognizing that they're not serving enough of adult Americans or soon to be adult Americans with the current model, right? The 4-year degree college model has been seen for the last 100 years at least as the surefire ticket to better jobs, to the corner office, being a doctor or a lawyer. And so that's been the aspiration, particularly in the last 50 years, right, for families, for their children to be successful. And I think that's beginning to break down to the point where, even the haves, if you think about the haves and the have-nots, even the haves are recognizing that the 4-year degree is not necessarily achieving the American dream for them or their children. And it's becoming, the affordability issue has kind of reached a fever pitch, and we're kind of looking at how jobs are changing and how quickly skills become obsolete. And so you might spend 4 years in college, and by the time you come out, the things you've learned need to be updated. And so all these things are converging along with AI to, I think, create a moment when, number one, we recognize that it's not working. I mean, that's part. I mean, it hasn't been working for a while, but I think it's sort of the wake up call, and we can talk about what led us to that moment. But we're here, and I think the fact that the economy has softened in the past 2 years is exacerbating and speeding it up, alongside of the what we're learning about AI and what that's doing to the white collar job market, for example.
Well, what are some of those new paths that we'll talk about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I want to say that they're not, some of them aren't new, but they are kind of being kind of pulled back up and analyzed as, wow, well, maybe, why aren't we doing more of this? And I would say probably number one on the list would be apprenticeships. And, when we think about apprenticeships, over the last 50 years, you think of someone you might know who wanted to be an electrician or a carpenter, because those are the two job roles where you have the most apprenticeships, registered apprenticeships. And pathways in those jobs can take 3 or 4 years, just like a college degree, but you're earning some money along the way. It's a very clear path for you. You know what the outcome's going to be, and you pretty definitely will get a job because you're already working in that role from the get-go. So apprenticeships would be probably the first thing that we should talk about. And the second that I became really clear in my research is that one of the ways that employers are really willing to hire without a degree is if the applicant has a industry certification or a couple of industry certifications in the areas that that the employers have specifically specified that you need to be trained in this. And a couple of examples would be, for instance, in data security, you pretty much have to have some of the network security certifications in order to get employment it's sort of on the first rung of the ladder. And the industry has sort of come together and said, okay, these are the skill sets. And you basically take a test, and you can do a course to train for the test, but it's basically you got to demonstrate mastery of the skill. And this is very prevalent in parts of tech, cybersecurity certainly, and then parts of healthcare where you often need a certification in order to earn a license. So I would say those two things, industry certifications and apprenticeships, are pathways, other pathways besides a degree that need to be elevated and kind of refit to all kinds of jobs. And then the third, which is kind of a combination of the two, is really what we call micro pathways. And this is the idea that a college itself is offering a shorter version of college in the form of a stack or a couple of micro credentials that the learner could earn. And then those are actually constructed, designed to prepare you for a particular job role. And you get into that first job, and then you can earn other micro pathways to build kind of like a step ladder to a career progression that moves you up the earnings curve, or that's the idea anyway. And that is beginning to happen. The organization that I founded, the Education Design Lab, is working with 100 community colleges right now on the micro pathway model. This idea that you would have a first kind of like a boot camp. It might be 4 to 6 months, and you get that first set of job skills. You get hired. The employers have designed the micro pathways with the school, right? So you get hired, and then you can move up from there. And that's where I see a combination of those sort of three types of pathways, let's call them. I see those as not replacing the 4-year degree, but why can't they be elevated and offered alongside the degree as another form of college, and offered by colleges, so that a learner, doesn't have to, figure out that maybe, oh, you need one of those things I just described to get hired, but wow, I already did the degree and I spent $100,000, and that's why you're seeing a lot of the the surveys that are showing that people are losing, faith in the value of and the ROI of college.
And in your book, you report that 56% of Americans now don't think college is necessarily worth it. About 40% of Americans have a bachelor's degree, but 50% fail to complete the degree in 6 years. Student debt is over $1 trillion. And you talk about a, quote, leaky, high-stakes education pipeline. What is that?
Well, the pipeline, I give the example in one state, Colorado, where, for every 100 students who start 9th grade, I think in their case, if I remember the number correctly, only 18 of those students end up getting a 4-year degree. And, sort of a lot of states track what are the points in the pipeline where they're losing people. And, more Americans are finishing high school than were, 50 years ago. And more of them are attempting college, or were at least up until about 10 years ago. But the fallout rate, or the dropout rate, or the stopout rate, people like to call it, is between 40 and 50%, depending on the type of student. And that's, what that suggests, if you were a business and you had 40 to 50% of your people, bailing out of your website or your app, after trying, you would create other products. You would see that you're not meeting the market need, and so you would create other, what segmentation is, what they call it in business, right? You would create other offerings for the addressable market that you're leaving on the table, as you would say in a business setting. And colleges aren't doing that because there's only one model. It's been the degree. And there are reasons for that, but I think it is beginning to change. And so I think, I don't know if you felt this way, but I try to be very hopeful in the book about where things are going and what's hopeful, because it's not like you'll still be able to send your 18-year-old to the college of your choice. I mean, there will be fewer colleges. There's going to be consolidation, but it will become actually probably easier for your child to get into the college of their choice. There won't be as many people going, partly because the number of 18-year-olds is actually just dropping. That's one reason, but also because as other pathways gain more stature and get some of the funding that's been reserved for degrees, that you'll have a lot more choices, and the outcomes of those choices will be more visible to in the narrative and to the population.
Well, Kathleen deLaski, you use the term majority learners quite often in your book.
New majority learners.
New majority learners. What does that mean?
Well, I actually dedicate the book to new majority learners because I describe them as the Americans, or the people for whom college was never designed. And what we're seeing over the past 100 years, really, or particularly the last 50 years, as we try to open the doors and we develop this college for all mantra and sort of policy action stance, where we wanted everyone to be college ready, and high schools in most cases been pushing everyone to go to college, and we've been trying to make it more available and more grants and loans and that kind of thing. As we do that, the problem is we hadn't designed it differently to meet the needs of these other learners. And so what I describe in the book is you meet a lot of people for whom college wasn't designed, and you see how they sort of are trying to get through the maze and often get spit out for reasons that really should be addressed. Things like they're a single mom, or and they can't get to campus. Or I interviewed one woman who wanted to be a teacher, but she was a single mom, and the school was 40 miles away, and there weren't online night versions, and she had to work. And eventually, now a program is being developed for her because we have such a teacher shortage. And so at 50 years old now, she has become a teacher and is teaching in the school where she went to elementary school in Louisiana. So it's a wonderful story about how we have to shift how we support learners who are not don't fit into that model where mom and dad are driving you off at 18 years old, as I was lucky enough to have happen, to the in the family SUV to the Leaky campus. That is a small proportion of learners. And most learners also then have to work, and something like 40% are working full time while they're in college. And so, that we haven't addressed their needs either, and we expect them to derive all the benefits, and yet they're dashing off to work, or they're dialing in at night, and so college has to change with them.
And you report in the book that you, I believe it was 1979, you got accepted into Duke. What was your process like, and how does that compare to today?
Yeah, well, I went to college in the 70s, when the kind of the second half of the 70s, when and I was surprised when I did the research in doing the book that only 15% of students were going to college at that point. But I was here in the Northern Virginia, like the DC area, and I was in a large public high school, and I don't think I mean you weren't really aware of the fact that this was before College for All. You weren't really aware of the fact that some kids were just like disappearing out of your classroom, like around 9th or 10th grade, and my high school was housing the vocational technical hub for the county, and so you would see these kids, what we would say out back. The women were in their beauty smocks. They were in the cosmetology program, or the guys were doing auto shop. There weren't very many choices, but that's kind of how they got, retracked. And so I don't think, those of us that were doing college track, we didn't even sign up for it. You just got sort of placed there based on something. Who knows? Maybe you did well in a particular math class or something. So it wasn't. It was before talented and gifted, and before people got concerned about tracking. And so when I went to Duke, it wasn't competitive. And so then when my kids came along, in the like 2007, 2008, they were in middle school and high school. I didn't realize how competitive it had become, really, because I hadn't been paying that much attention. And they were really struggling. And I think this is one of the reasons that I wrote the book, is that for them, neither of them could make that sort of easy college. Getting into a good college was going to be a total struggle for both of them, and it caused a lot of mental and even physical stress in the household. And I remember saying to my one daughter, who didn't do her homework ever, you got to do your homework or you're going to be flipping burgers at McDonald's. It was a sort of a binary, back then it was like college or bust. As far as I was concerned, I had a daughter who wasn't going to be an electrician, in her, and that was my view. So in researching the book, I went back and took all of my stats from high school, and I put them into an AI agent that could tell you like your chances of getting into a particular college, right? And I put all my stats into Duke, my GPA, my class rank, my activities, and it said that I had a 3% chance of getting into my alma mater. And in the 70s, I only applied to one school, and nobody thought twice about it. And so, wow, had times changed? And so that was one of the things that I think has contributed definitely to the mental stress issues that we have with American high school students and American college students, is the gauntlet they had to get through to get into these colleges, particularly good colleges, which are actually more competitive than ever, is it's not helping their social and emotional well-being, right? And I wanted to point that out. And it's one of the reasons that I wrote the book, that if we have more choices, and students have more choices that don't feel like one student said to me, who went to a college prep high school, he was a junior, he said, I feel like if I'm not on the college track, I'm nothing. And wow, I mean, it really hit home, because that's kind of how I made my kids feel.
Yeah, I think you and I are about the same age, and I had the same experience. You filled out an application and got accepted, and off you went, and you were getting your golden ticket.
Mm-hmm.
But the application process today is really intricate, isn't it? It's
Mm-hmm.
almost an industry.
Yes, and you're incented to apply. It's easy to apply to many, many schools because you don't have to fill out a different essay and different. And so that's one of the reasons it's really interesting how enrollment or application rates at the most elite colleges are higher than ever. They're way up, and then at the kind of middle tier or less competitive colleges, they're losing enrollment. And so it's interesting how, like the brand power is stronger than ever. That may change now because of, various things going on at a couple of, the Ivy League schools, and with international students, things may change. I think people are really, wondering about next fall. But it's still, what we have to get to is a new narrative, which is not, right now we have two conflicting narratives. One is that you have to go to college to get a good job. And the second is college is too expensive and it's not really worth it anymore. And so those are opposing narratives that are really confusing American families. Certainly when I went around and did my interviews, there was just a lot of stress, and some of that stress was focused at counselors, school counselors on the front lines who were supposed to be giving advice to learners. And I ended up profiling a one high school in Denver, which was considered like the one of the really top college prep high schools, but it served sort of a middle and lower income area of Denver. And they those students were everybody had to apply to college, everybody had to take AP courses, but then they had a number of people, a growing number of people over the past 2 or 3 years of students who were like, I don't think so. I don't think I want to do this. And their biggest reason that they gave tended to be debt, fear of debt, or fear that they didn't know what they want to do, and so they couldn't imagine like saddling their families with that kind of debt. So that was number one reason. And number two was I just can't imagine sitting in a classroom for another 4 years. I can't imagine. I want to work with my hands, or not even I want to work with my hands, but I want to get on with my life. And that's not a neither of those reactions were prevalent 10 years ago in these same high schools, because I used to be in the K-12 charter school movement, and when the College for All was sort of at its height and college enrollment was at its height, and this wasn't prevalent. And so what I tried to profile in the book is how high schools are trying to share more information about non-degree pathways. So I remember I mentioned apprenticeships and ways to do industry credentials. So high schools are starting, I mean, this is pretty early work, but they're starting to try to, kind of have an apples to apples, what will it cost you? What kind of salary, what kind of career path can you try to make or try to have? And, the early results of that are early. I mean, we don't know a lot about how that's working, partly because it's really hard for the high schools to get good data about what are the non-college route options, because that industry has been so well greased that it's hard to know where else to suggest your students look. And so this service called Willow Education, I followed them. They're trying to create a kind of like an app for every region that they work with, to really analyze the other quality programs and stack them up for the students, in their navigation wizards or their apps, to see what else they might look at and consider.
Kathleen deLaski, you also report that in 2020, Donald Trump signed an executive order taking some college requirements away from federal jobs. IBM has reduced its college requirement for many jobs as well. So are those steps that you see as positive?
Yeah, that movement, which really began in force around 2020 with President Trump in his first term, taking that step that was applauded by workforce groups, that was to say, yeah, let's look at jobs and see where we could eliminate the requirement for a degree, because a lot of times it was seen as just something that got added in somewhere along the way because it was a nice marker. It's a good general way to tell whether somebody has talent, or not talent, but actually maybe can get through a gauntlet and can meet deadlines and maybe has a certain level of maturity. The degree is good for that, but there are other ways to demonstrate those skills. So if the job doesn't actually require things you would have learned in college, I think more and more employers are waking up to this idea that, oh, I could actually get a more diverse and interesting, potentially, pipeline of or source for my talent pool if I offered other ways for people to demonstrate their readiness for this role. So that whole movement is being called skills-based hiring, which some of your viewers probably have heard about. the some of the HR organizations, like the Society of Human Resource Managers, and the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce. They are, actively trying to help employers like rethink their job descriptions to be more skills based and less, degree based. And that's it's early, and companies like IBM are early leaders in this. But I think that's another one of the trend lines that will make it easier for people to take these other pathways besides getting the degree. I mean, that's not to say I should say there are still many jobs that will require a degree, for decades to come, and those would include anything related to a like higher order license, like practicing medicine, being an RN, accounting, certain, even being like a physical therapist, although that may change. What's putting downward pressure on removing some of the degree requirements is just shortages of talent. Like physical therapists is a great example. You have to have a master's degree, and there just aren't enough people coming into the field because the salaries are not that high. Same with mental health workers. A lot of these jobs, excuse me, require master's degrees, and they're just not getting enough people coming into the pipeline because the jobs don't cover paying your student loans off. And so what's starting to happen is that in behavioral health, it's already happening. It's happening a little bit in like the lower levels of nursing and teaching, is that, we're starting to allow people with less, degree, but maybe more experience, come into the field.
Well, a lot of people may recognize you from your years at ABC News or as the Clinton administration's DOD spokesperson. But when you left Duke in the late 70s, did you feel employable? Did you feel like you had accomplished something?
I actually sort of bumped up against the constraints of what a college degree could do for me. Because I knew what I wanted to do. I had done an internship in high school in the television field. And I knew that I wanted to get into this new field that it was suddenly allowing women to have what seemed like a really interesting job, which was to be a TV news correspondent. This was the era when Barbara Walters was making it big and Jane Pauley was coming up. I mean, only your older viewers will probably know who those folks are. But I was really inspired because, the traditional female roles didn't, were not going to be in my sweet zone. I wanted to do something that combined. I had done acting and performing in school, and had already worked in the theater. And so when I got to college, I was sort of like, wow, why can't I get? There were no journalism courses at Duke, which was fascinating. And when I asked why, they said, well, that's a trade. We don't teach trades. So I went down to the TV station and got myself an apprenticeship. It wasn't paid, it wasn't registered. I just basically worked for free, which you're not supposed to do anymore now. The internships are supposed to be paid. But I was so lucky because I could do that. College wasn't expensive. I didn't have to work a job and get paid like in the dining hall or, at the local McDonald's. I didn't have to do that because my college degree was inexpensive and my parents were, able to help me. But so that's why I think in those early days, you had to just sort of figure it out yourself. So for me, where I feel the degree really came in handy was, later, I ended up getting a job after graduation at that same TV station in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. It was the CBS affiliate at the time. And I talk in the book about the kinds of people who still, that I still really would recommend a degree to. And there are people who either, in my case, I found it useful later, was the sort of the legitimacy label that it gives you, and to build your own confidence. When I would go around and interview people in the South in the 70s, it was, it was kind of like that movie Anchorman, the movie that Will Ferrell was in. If anyone's seen it, you know that the women were treated as sort of show toys, particularly if they were blonde, which I was, and you got called darling a lot, and having a degree. Not that you would, talk about it all the time, but it just gave you the confidence that, you knew how to conduct yourself, and, you knew how to ask questions. I had been a political science major, so I understood a little bit about politics. It gave you that extra bit of support. And I found that then I wanted to go to graduate school to have even more, street cred, if you will. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and that was my goal. So I thought, oh, I'm going to go to a graduate program at Harvard. That will be the ticket, because then I can prove that I know what I'm talking about. And I tell the story of Peter Jennings, who became my friend. He was the anchor at ABC News. He did not have a college degree, and he would lord it over me that he knew way more than me. Like, he had this chip on his shoulder about not having gone to college that was really fascinating, because he was so well respected. But he carried that throughout his life, I think. And so I say in the book that, some people will always feel that they need that. And so, then it's just a matter of figuring out how to get the degree without breaking the bank. So that's one category. I track 4 categories of people that I think still really need college. And, legitimacy label seekers is one of them. And a second one I'll mention that's really key is folks who need a way to, they need the class transport ticket, if you will. So folks who are in a lower economic class, often that's immigrants coming to the country for the first time, and they came because they want their kids to have a better life than they did. And the way for them, the way they see that happening is their kids are going to go to college and become, go into one of the professions that that are surefire, economic winners. And the research bears that out, that those students, that if you're trying to get from, the lowest economic level to the middle class, that a college degree, at least historically, has been able to do that for you. And while it's not clear that that will continue to be the case, given what we've talked about, I still think it's the best bet for people in that category. And so when you look at who is choosing not to go to college right now, and college enrollment has been down about 12% over the last decade. It's ticking up slightly now, but it's not degrees. It's people coming for short-term credentials, or they're high schoolers who are doing, they're enrolling in a college class while they're in high school. That's what's driving enrollment gains right now. But what I was going to say is, it's interesting that the people, the categories of people who are stepping away from college right now tend to be wealthier people. And you might ask, well, why is that? And the answer is that they have a backstop, right? They have networks, they have a parent's basement often that they can stay in. I have some relatives in that case, who are doing that if they did art degrees or psychology, and they're trying to figure out, how do I make this work in the work world? And they're pursuing their passions, right? And they're doing so without being without getting a degree.
And we should note that the book Who Needs College Anymore is not necessarily about the elite institutions, the 75 or so around the country. 2% of the student population go to those schools, but it's more about the 5,800 colleges that represent all across America and many different topics. I want to go back one more time to Duke. You got a liberal arts degree, and you studied the great books and history and all these things. is that worthwhile today with all the information that's online and the massive online open courses that are available, et cetera, et cetera?
I mean, I think in a perfect world, it would still be highly valuable, right? The idea that you have a guide, somebody who is knowledgeable and excited and live in person with you and pushing you, to think critically about, comparing. I took an entire class on Ernest Hemingway, which was, I still talk about all the time. And I still talk about what I learned about, from a historical perspective, a writing perspective, sociological. So yes, in a perfect world, it would make total sense. It would still be, worth it, if that's how you would put it. But, you know, my Duke, when I went all in, was 6,000 a year. Um, I think it maybe is what in the 80s now. I mean, Wellesley College just announced that their tuition is 100,000. Um, you could say, well, but the nation is we're a lot wealthier as individuals, but it hasn't. The cost of tuition hasn't kept pace with inflation. Yes, one college president said to me, "Well, look, we all discount heavily, so students aren't actually paying sticker price." And while that's true, I don't, people don't know that when they're analyzing whether they're going to go to college, and when they're at the beginning um, of that uh, application journey, you don't know that, right? You only know that when you're in the final process of deciding which school to go to. So I'd say that what we have to figure out, and I say this in the book in the last chapter called The Great College Reset, we have to figure out how can we provide those wonderful experiences that you and I had, it sounds like, um, in shorter, more affordable forms. I don't just want to tell people to go take a Hemingway course online. I mean, that's, my nephew took a college course online, last semester, and he said, and he ended up dropping out because he said, everybody had their screen turned off, their video turned off, and nobody was interacting, and the professor was kind of frustrated, and he said it was just not an engaging experience. And we have to figure out how to continue the engagement level, even with students. I teach at a college here in Northern Virginia in person, and it's hard to keep them engaged even in person. But let me tell you, um, because it's a different game now, how to engage and how to deliver value for students. And it's about to change even more now that we have, sort of AI changing by leaps and bounds, both how we teach and how we hire, how we learn. Each of these pieces of the puzzle are getting, completely, um, I would say, revolutionized. I don't think that's too strong of a word. And so, I guess my answer to your question is that it's our responsibility, I think, as the generations that have, benefited from the old way, right, to make the new way just as valuable, although it's going to have to be in a different way.
Kathleen deLaski, what do you teach
Oh, I
at
teach
college?
pretty much the topics around this book. The main thing I'm teaching is design thinking. Um, I teach in the Honors College at George Mason University, but we use like how to think about redesigning higher education as our canvas, if you will. So design thinking, in my view, is one of the tool sets that can really help the next generation or this current generation, bring alive, how to be critical thinkers, how to be creative problem solvers, because and the whole book, my whole book is written, through the lens of design thinking. Design thinking is a way to, um, really work on like big, hairy, audacious problems by breaking them down one piece at a time and looking at the needs of the users, whether you're building a killer product or you're solving, hunger or, in our case, we're looking at this diploma divide and the education gap. So I bring students into the decision making and the problem, both the problem definition and then looking at the user needs. And then we start to do ideation around pieces of the problem about how we can have solutions. And then we prototype solutions. So what design thinking does is allows you to basically bring your students into the process of, thinking about, I call it Save the World 101, but how to be engaged in problem solving, and it builds their collaboration skills, their communication skills, their critical thinking and empathy skills. So it's going very well. I mean, I think it's early days to figure out how to teach it really well, but I'm enjoying it.
How did you go from ABC News and the Pentagon into charter schools and education reform?
Well, I think like many people probably who get to a certain age, when you look back at like your career twists and turns, you recognize that most of them are just a decision in the moment to a take a role or take a step because it just seemed like the best idea at the time. And then it's only when you look back that you try to like find the patterns or make sense of it, right? So I mean, and one of the things that you didn't mention that was probably one of my favorite times, and for me most instructive times in thinking about how to consider where we are today, was after I left the Pentagon. I went back to journalism, and but I went to this new startup that was in Virginia called America Online. It was 1995. And I had been in charge of the Pentagon's website as part of and it was like one of the first websites, right? And I thought, oh, I know what I'm doing here. And I went to my job at AOL was to create kind of help figure out how we were going to do politics online, how we were going to do news, how we were going to increase civic engagement, like using this new thing called the internet to help citizens like form their views about society. So I feel like some of the things we started then are now in their later forms, and so there's good and bad to say about what we started. One of the things we worried about was that everyone was going to go into their news bubbles if we gave them personalized news, because it was the first time we could do that. And for me, that was such it was such a cool idea on one level because we could speak to all these different audiences. But I think we realized even, 1995, 1996, that we were going to create bubbles of information that were going to make people less tolerant of other people's ideas. And when we sat around and talked about this, like, what if? And so anyway, that's sort of a tangent to say that I had that piece of my career journey in between, journalism and the Pentagon, and then going into education, which was kind of this whole second half of my career.
In your book, Who Needs College Anymore?, you spend a bit of time on Southern New Hampshire University, Western Governors University, 250,000 students at SNHU. What's your take? I think we've all seen the commercials for those institutions.
Right, they're very good at consumer. In fact, I was just with the president who just stepped down last week. He stepped down a year ago to start an AI project. So I highlight schools like those two. They're both mostly online, and I highlight them because they, to me, are the type of universities that will be growing in the future. And I call them national platforms. And it's because I don't say this I say this in a positive way, they have attributes of businesses, but they're very student centric. I don't want to suggest that they're not, that they're just just out to make a buck. They they know how to market. You just said you've seen commercials, like they've done Super Bowl commercials, right? They know how to market to a broad set of needs, and they know how to differentiate their product offerings to serve lots of folks across the spectrum. And I say in the book that within a decade, we will probably be in a situation where the national platforms, the national universities that are partly online, but may have, they may have offices that are, physical presences as well, will take on more and more of the market share, if you will become bigger portions of where people get their learning products from. And so you can imagine, and I suggest that Amazon will probably even get into the game. Amazon already supports its 700,000 frontline workers by having they offer free upskilling and through partnerships with colleges, and they could easily get into the game, not where they're directly offering classes, but where they're packaging, like, the Amazon being resellers of other colleges' learning stacks. So you could imagine you could go to your Amazon cart and get an assessment that shows that you have that you've demonstrated mastery for a particular sales job, or a job in digital marketing, or cybersecurity. You would be able to get your course that way, and you could do a stack. And companies like Google are already offering certificates. Those are being distributed now currently through third parties, like this group called Coursera. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things going on. And when you look at where the growth is in that segment. Arizona State University is another big player. So these are some of the ones to watch to see how they are, they're really amassing more market share, while traditional universities are losing market share for the most part. And it's not to say that traditional universities will go away. Some of them will, but most of them will just have to learn to partner with these other groups, these platforms that are good distributors, and good repackagers. Because let's face it, colleges are really bad at marketing to anyone besides the 17 or 18-year-old. I mean, that's who they're used to marketing to, right? And they need, that needs to change, or they need to partner with folks who do know how to do that.
When it comes to reforming education in some of the ways that we've been talking about, are you seeing resistance from high schools, from parents, from faculty senates, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. Yes, all of the above. Yeah, I think parents are often well, I put myself in this category too, right? Unless you're like working in this field and you're seeing the change, the last memo you got was, that my kid needs college. And this is why I'm working so hard. This is why I'm saving money. This is why I did the 529 plan, right? That our kids need to go to college. And right now, part of the problem is, if you have an 18-year-old now, is Kathleen, having written the book, don't have a better suggestion for most people. I mean, if I could sit down with your kid and we could look at, there might be some specific other really good available options today. But what I'm describing is probably more widespread in 5 to 10 years. So if you have an 18-year-old today, I mean, there are some really excellent apprenticeships, and more white collar fields like banking and insurance and businesses are getting into apprenticeship. But right now you could go and look at apprenticeship.gov. That's a pretty good site. But the majority of stuff on there today is going to be what the traditional trades, and those are great. Those are great options. But if you're looking for a job that formerly needed a degree, we haven't elevated yet the funding structures to make them widespread.
High schools are set up for the college track for the most part still?
Yes, I mean I would say that's true. But here's an interesting trend that I write about in the book I mean, there's quite an increase in interest by students to have more of the of the kind of what's called CTE, the career and technical education training. And high schools are starting to understand that the line between blue collar jobs and white collar jobs is really blurring, and so students are asking to get certifications in data security, or they want to learn how to do data analysis or robotics. So and now AI. I mean, so a lot of things are starting to get built in to the curriculum, or at least the the electives offerings that any students can take. So now there's kind of a new movement that's called CTE for all. It's not replacing college for all, but it's competing with it in I think, a productive way. It's not to say everybody should become a plumber, but it's to say everybody should be able to not have to choose between a college track and a trade track, right? And that you should be able to take the coursework. I feature a young man in the book who took a bunch of these data security certifications in high school and didn't think he was college material. So he was going to go to community college, but he put his resume up on Indeed over the summer and ended up getting recruited by AWS to work in their data center. He was making, $63,000 his first year, and then ended up, by the time I interviewed him, he's 23 years old and he's a software engineer, pretty much self-taught, building off of the first jobs that he got. So, that's the example of how if you're a motivated person, you can get there without a degree in certain fields.
And CTE again stands for?
Career and technical education. It's the new term for vocational ed, which is more what it was called, when we went to high school.
Yeah. You highlight North Dakota and Alabama. Why?
Mm-hmm. Well, those are two places. I describe one of the trends is skills-based hiring that we talked about. And the other trend that people are trying to develop is what's called a skills wallet, which is the idea that all the skills, if we move more towards a hiring landscape where your skills are your currency, some states are trying to create a kind of universal wallet for you where you would be able to carry, your skills around and cluster them how you want and add them as you get them, whether it's in high school, whether it's in college, whether it's on a job or a community experience. And then you'd be able to make yourself seen, make yourself visible to employers who might want to hire you. So, the idea of wallets, we've all probably got a digital wallet of some kind, like with our airplane tickets and concert tickets on our phones today. But I say within 3 to 5 years, you're going to, in some states that are kind of leading the way, you're going to also be able to have your skills in a wallet that you can share with an employer if you're interested in getting a particular job to see, and also with these navigation tools that will show you, okay, you want to be a pharmacy technician, how close are your skills? Like, what's the distance you need to travel to get to that job role.
This is not the point of the book, but I do want to spend the last 2 minutes here of our conversation asking you about the politicization of higher education that we are experiencing today. Mm-hmm. You've got protests, you've got, left-leaning faculties and curriculum as seen by some. You've got government funds in colleges. What are your thoughts?
Well, it has been a strange time to come out with this book because I would say that when I've been going around speaking at conferences over the past 2 months and on the book tour, and I have had a couple of, like college presidents stand up and say, wow, really, is this the time to be telling us that we need to embrace the future? It's really, isn't it the time for us to like rally around each other? And she didn't use the word circle the wagons, but that was the that we need to hang together. What I've been saying to that is that the approach that I'm describing is much more of a yes and approach. Like there's nothing, we don't need to tear down the degree as a model. We just need to figure out a way to serve the 62% that haven't had access to it or for whom it didn't work. And I would argue that one of the reasons that we have the resentment that, resulted in this, populist movement that brought, President Trump back to the White House, some people are pointing to the diploma divide and the economic divide that results from it, or at least is seen to is perceived to stem from it as one of the the things we need to fix to bring civil society back together.
You report that there's over 1 million certifications available. 30% of jobs need a certification of some type. And we'll close with this quote from the book. Can the 4-year degree be saved? Not for most learners, I would argue. Once less expensive alternative pathways become clearer and surer, a full-on degree will seem impractical for new majority learners. The degree may be in trouble, but college can be saved. Here's the book, Who Needs College Anymore? Imagining a Future Where Degrees Don't Matter. The author, Kathleen deLaski. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for listening to this week's Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. If you like this podcast, tell your friends, rate and review us, and follow us on social media at BookTV for more updates and schedule information. Also, if you're looking for more of C-SPAN's book programming, follow our Bookshelf podcast feed. It's a one-stop source for the Afterwards, Book Notes Plus, and Q&A podcasts. Discover compelling conversations with authors, historians, and thought leaders all in one place. Subscribe to C-SPAN's Bookshelf podcast today. And next week on the Q&A podcast, our guest is former Ohio Governor John Kasich, talking about his book, Heaven Help Us. It's on the impact of organized religion in changing and improving society.